right, we'll get started. We'll be a small but intimate group. We're super excited to be with you all today. We're up against SalCon, so maybe everyone can't get over there and they'll spill over here. But we're super excited to engage in a dialogue from the Teach for All perspective in terms of how do you reach students in places that are hard to reach through technology while also keeping the experience super personalized. My name is Aimee Eubanks Davis. I'm the founder and CEO of Braven. Braven helps students who are first in their families to go to college on the Pell Grant here in the United States come out and earn an entire dollar instead of 66 cents on the dollar. We have a hybrid model. 80% of our content is actually online. And yet the secret in the Braven sauce is actually that students are in a cohort of 6 to 8, and they have a professional from the workforce who comes in and actually makes sure that they are engaging in the content and honestly building out their network. I'm going to have each of the panelists go down and do a brief introduction of them and their ventures. I also was a Teach for America Corps member way back in the day, 1995 in New Orleans, Louisiana, and my experience through Teach for America is really what inspired me to start Braven. So we'll go to you next.
Cool. Hi everyone, my name is Richard. I am originally from South Africa, most recently from Australia, where I did my teacher training in the Teach for Australia program. I, together with a colleague, founded an organization called Maths Pathway, which has spent the last 10 years tripling the student outcomes of kids in math in Australia, and most recently in Cambodia, and hopefully soon in Malaysia, and with a few pilots in the UK. And so part of our secret sauce is, again, we're very heavy tech users. We use a lot of personalization for our kids, but we engage the teachers in that journey. We're all about the what next. So the data is great, but actually what you do with it matters more. And so we do a lot of work keeping things as much offline as online to get that kind of impact.
Awesome.
Great. Thanks. My name is Erin Fitzgerald. I was a 2009 Teach for America alum, which pretty much set me on the course of everything I'm doing now. Thank you, Wendy. So my organization is called YiYa. It's based in Uganda. YiYa is a Ugandan word that means to innovate. And that's what we've been doing since 2016, is teaching young people in Uganda how to innovate using the engineering design process as a tool for problem solving. So helping them solve challenges in their local community by designing low-tech technologies that use local resources with the goal of supporting like math and science concepts, for example. And where this shift came between where we were in person and our new offline approach is that COVID hit. Like that happened everywhere. Everyone had these things pop up. And we couldn't reach our students anymore. And to give you perspective, the schools were closed for over 2 years. It was the longest school closures in the world. And these are students out in the most rural, you can't get there by car often, communities. And so we sat down and said, we teach engineering, we should be able to fix this problem. And we gave ourselves 2 constraints. So one of the constraints was it has to use infrastructure that's already in the communities, and it has to use behavior that people already have in the communities. We can't ship anything out, and we can't try and change anyone's behavior. And then the second one was it has to be interactive. So we can't just spew out to students. We need to hear back from them, check their understanding, and see, are they engaging and are they absorbing content. So that's where we started our flagship program, Air Science. It is meant to feel like a live online class, like a teacher teaching over Zoom. And we accomplish this without internet, without smartphones, through an integrated system of radios and those phones from the early 2000s, those little keypad phones. And the way the system works is that you have a teacher in the radio, and she's teaching a live lesson. Now, she wants to check for understanding. So she asks a question, and the students at home have access to these keypad phones. They dial into this very low-tech app, and they see a menu of choices, and those choices are possible answers to the questions. And so they choose one, and the secret sauce is that those all populate in live time a dashboard, which the teacher is monitoring. And this is really powerful because it lets her see individually, name by name, what students' answers are, but also lets her see big trends. So how is the classroom doing altogether? So one one teacher in radio probably has around 2,000 students in that radio frequency. She can be really specific. Me, you answered option C. That's right, keep innovating. But as a class, I'm seeing that we're really struggling with this concept. So let's dig in and talk about it some more. And so it gives her both those flexible options. What it also does is it turns this radio program I'm listening to into this live virtual classroom where we're all together. I know there's other people out there. I can hear their names and how they're responding to questions. On the back end, that data is super important. It helps us to change the program flexibly to student needs. It's pretty high tech on the back end, all the things that the system's going into powering this to be very simple on the front end. And I'll just close by saying we have 30,000 users, because I know I've overtalked. Sorry. We have 30,000 users on our platform right now. And to our surprise, a good proportion of them are 15 to 25-year-olds who left school when they were in middle school. And for a variety of reasons. There's child marriage, there's teen pregnancy, there's not enough money for school fees, there's having to make money for their families. And so that, right in middle school, they lost access. And now, even at the age of 20, 21, they are still hungry for any sort of education they can get their hands on. And there are 100 million young people in Africa who don't have access to school, don't have access to education. And that's kind of our big vision. The whole point of our model is to get to those 100 million people and to give them access to education that they deserve.
So don't go quite as deep yet into your model, but give us an overview, that's okay, Erin, into who you are and your connection to the Teach for All network.
Sure. Hi everyone, this is Seemant. I run Meraki Foundation out of India. And Meraki essentially imagines an India of school-ready children. In 2019, the National Family Health Survey conducted by the government pegged the number of children accessing preschool at age 5 at 13.6%. 50% of those children, when they enter school, will not be ready for it. And that's the fight that we are fighting. We imagine that one day all children who enter school are essentially ready for it. The way we work with towards solving this problem is that we work with the state governments in India, currently accessing around 47,000 preschools, 1.3 million families. We design programs and policies essentially to do one thing, and that's change the environment around the child. And the way that we believe that this can happen is that if there are enough programs designed, one, for the family or the parents, where the child spends maximum time. Secondly, the preschool teacher, where the child spends the second most amount of time, and the environment in which this preschool teaching happens, which is the preschool itself. And so by marrying this concept of working with the parents, the preschool teacher, as well as improving infrastructural as well as service-related outcomes for preschools, we believe the environment of the child will improve, and essentially and the outcomes for the child will improve as well.
Great.
That's me.
So take us back, I'm going to ask each of you, to your classrooms. So we all came through the Teach for All network, a couple of us through Teach for America, a couple of us from other members in the network. Teach for All is all about inspiring typically recent college grads to go into classrooms and really try to level the playing field for the group of students we have the privilege to teach, who are often from some of the most underserved backgrounds across the world. So I know for me, as a former 6th grade teacher in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1995, one of the biggest things that I think inspired me about my students was the level of potential that they had, but not the level of access. They did not have the same level of access that other young people had. And when I think about what, again, inspired me to start Braven was actually watching them grow up, going off to college or into the university system, get a bachelor's degree, and actually not end up strong in the workforce, end up maybe even worse off if they had debt. They weren't getting the kinds of jobs that we thought that their bachelor's degrees would afford them. So can you just rewind the hands of time for you, Richard? Like when you got started in your classroom, what did you see that's really made you think about the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
And tell us where where you taught again. And
yeah, sure. So 2011 in Melbourne, outer suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, a community of people who 50% unemployed parents, 49% of the remainder, the other 49% were in the lowest level of employment, and just the most beautiful children ever, right? But no access to kind of quality levels of education often. And the kind of, I had two amazing experiences right at the beginning of that journey. I walked into a 7th grade math class. I had done my teacher training, my preparation, and they said, here's a 7th grade math textbook. Like, that is your resource, that is your curriculum. Here are your 25 12-year-olds, go. And I went, seems reasonable. It's how I was taught math. About 4 minutes later, I discovered that was not reasonable because not all 12-year-olds are the same. And I think one of the things that really stuck out to me very early on, and I came from a kind of very private sector management consulting background into teaching, right? And these kind of the systemic problems just keep popping up again and again about, and I had these kids that tell me things like, no, I'm not a maths person. And if anybody tells me, I flinch, physically, when you do that, right? Nobody says, no, I'm not, I don't read. What? And so, the whole point for me is that the theory of change from day one was, I think all we need to do is give these kids success quickly and immediately in the work that they're doing. And I'm pretty sure that's going to turn you from not a maths person into a maths person in about a week. And that's what we did. So the work we do now is much more sophisticated. But in that early days, I literally had a piece of paper and I'd highlighted for kids, here are the skills that you need to work on next. Come to me, we're going to make little groups. We'll do some cool activities to work on that. And I had, later on a group of kind of 15-year-olds who, within 2 weeks of the start of a term, they had consumed all of the material I had prepared for them. And they said, so this math just makes sense now. Why does it make sense? I was like, well, it actually is supposed to make sense. That's a kind of a revelation to a lot of people, is that it is supposed to make sense to you. And so, that experience in the classroom, it said to us, you have to now do this for more than 25 kids.
That's great. So tell us now a little bit more, like Erin did, about your actual work today.
Yeah, sure. So the kind of more sophisticated 10-year-old version of that piece of paper with the highlighting is that it's a really basic theory of change. It's not new, right? Can we work out, you're in 7th grade, say, right? A 12-year-old kid. What did you miss? Right? So you're sitting there, and we can work out really precisely which specific concepts and understandings in mathematics. Mathematics is a really sequential domain. What do you not know yet? Right? So you're sitting, you're trying to do algebra, you're trying to do financial literacy, but you don't know what a fraction is. Turns out that matters a lot to kind of what happens next in your life. We've heard, if you've been to any math-related sessions in the last 2 days, I don't have to restate the problem for you. And so the work we do now is we built an entire learning and teaching model that's been efficacy-driven from day one to say, well, our goal is to get kids to where they're supposed to be and beyond in terms of standards or curriculum or whatever, however you want to measure that, as quickly as possible. And so we have resources for teachers that are data-driven instruction. We have an entire personalized learning program for every kid that's really specific to what they need at that point. And it happens, kind of to your point, within the structure of a school. We're not trying to tear down the system. There's a bunch of stuff I'd love to change about the system, right? But we have constraints that we need to operate in. We don't want to put more work on teachers. That's the last thing we need. And so just really optimizing what that process looks like. As I said, we get kids will make 3 years worth of growth in a year. And they love maths.
That's incredible. So Erin, connect us back to your Teach for America experience. Where were you in the core when you think about what you learned during those 2 years, maybe plus if you continued onwards, and how it applies now to the venture that you're working in?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I was in the inaugural cohort in Milwaukee in 2009. As a background, I had a degree in literature with a minor in mechanical engineering, and I was very excited to teach literature in Milwaukee, and had a call about a week before I was supposed to fly out from the director there saying, can you teach math? Really, I have a lot of English teachers. And so I ended up teaching math, and I taught it at the algebra sophomore level, basically. In inner city Milwaukee, Milwaukee's one of the most racially segregated cities in the U.S. A lot of divisions and a lot of discrepancies between how information is taught in the city schools, as well as compared to how it's taught out in the urban area, in the suburban areas. And I know this because as part of the training, you know, taking your master's and taking all these classes with TFA, you go out when you visit different schools. And I was blown away, as you were, right, at how like the content was so different and expectations were so different. But I also had every single student in my class that said, I hate math, I don't want to do math. Some of them were homeless. I don't see how this has anything to do with my life. And they had these benchmark tests they would take, and it was doing nothing. Like I was just like, we aren't. Like, they still hate math. After this benchmark, like, I'm not really sure they actually learned it because the way the district did benchmarks was very not attached to, like, adding on to information. It was very, like, siloed. And so we started, I was teaching over the summer an Upward Bound class of people who would be first-generation college attenders and helping them gain skills. And that's when I decided, projects. We're going to do projects. Everyone hates math, but everyone loves projects. And so we did a bunch of hands-on projects, and that's when students said, sort of similar to what you said, oh, like, I can do math, and oh, there's a reason to do math. Who knew? And that experience propelled me to work at the Museum of Science in Boston, and then to be asked to go to Uganda to teach engineering to blind students, which I thought was just the next challenge after Teach for America. That makes sense. And that's from there what informed, you know, I was at MIT, and at MIT there are all these initiatives. We're going to build like a better water pump for Ghana. We're going to have, you know, like 1 laptop per child. Just all these initiatives that were not based in the communities. So really brilliant math and science concepts being used to make technologies that may or may not fit the needs of their community. So one example that I'm sure many people know is the mosquito nets that they've given out by USAID, by UNICEF, and they're used as fishing nets. Right? Yeah. So like they're not, so there's a disconnect is what I'm trying to say. And so that was my mission, was like, can we get these students who have lack of access to education to really love math and science by doing projects that help their community, this sort of like grassroots kind of development. And that's what they do. So they make bicycle-powered phone chargers, gravity-powered reading lights, they made hand sanitizers 3 years before COVID, I'm very excited about. And so they do these really low-tech projects that teach them that math and science have a point, have a reason to be used, and also help them feel a sense of agency in their communities because they're solving real challenges.
That's great. Seemant, tell us a little bit about where you are in the Teach for All network, how your classroom experience impacted the work that you do today, and tell us a little bit more about that work in detail.
Sure, thanks. I'm loving the maths talk. Just a side note, I was the maths director for Teach for India when I passed out of the fellowship. Almost makes me want to go back and start teaching maths again.
And say what year again?
Yeah. So actually, the story goes back to 12 years. I was a 2011 Teach for India fellow out of New Delhi, India. But I think the story actually started around 39 years ago. And I don't think I'd be wrong to say that I was actually destined to teach. And so the reason why I say that is my father was a middle school teacher, a government school teacher. My mother was an Anganwadi worker. More of that I'll talk about when we talk about the topic of discussion today. But essentially I was the first English language learner in the family, first engineer, first postgraduate, and I postgraduated from this college called IIM Bangalore, which is one of the decent colleges in India. And I think that sort of set the pathway for me to actually take up teaching. Obviously, I did not do the B.Ed degree, which is a formal degree that you need to actually start teaching. But in 2011, I thought that I'd go teach because everyone in my family taught, including my uncles and aunts. And that's where this all started. I think one of the key things that I remember from my classrooms, one was there were a couple of girls, Ruchi and Nikita, I remember their names, who in one of these maths classrooms, again, we had this habit of celebrating growth rather than toppers. So we'd say, oh, look at this test we did, and Ruchi, she grew by around 30%, Nikita grew by 20%, and these are kids who typically wouldn't do well in academics. And remember one time, they were actually the toppers in that way in terms of growth. And we did this like small clap, really acknowledging the growth that they had done. I remember then looking at them and they started crying. And I was like, what? Why? This is a happy moment. And I think I took them out of the class and I was just checking up on them and, why is it that you're crying at this moment? This is like a happy moment. And they were like, in Hindi, they said, Bhaiya, aisa kabhi kisi ne nahi bola, which meant that nobody has ever actually said this to us. And that was like a moment for me where I said, I came into Teach for India to become a teacher. I think that moment taught me a lot, so made me a learner actually at that point in time. And so through that experience, I thought maths is the way to go. So picked up the maths opportunity with Teach for India, led that vertical for about a year. But also at some point in time, I think my personal journey of having been a child of a teacher and a preschool teacher, there was something that was always begging at me, which essentially was that, children in low-income private schools, and I would compare some of the performances that children in low-income private schools would do versus government schools, and I would see that somehow that performance was better. And one of the key reasons why I thought that was happening was because parents were more involved. And I saw that parents would show up to these parent-teacher meetings. They would actually ask questions. They were more involved, and that's where I thought that that's where Meraki took birth. Meraki is a Greek word. It means to leave a piece of yourself in the work that you do. We thought parents leave a piece of themselves in the children that they raise, and that's why we started Meraki back in 2016.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you've merged the online and the offline experience? So it's very much so focused on preschool students and their parents. Can you talk to us a little bit about how it looks to merge those two experiences?
Yeah, I think the entire sort of experience can be summarized into one acronym, and it's EAT, E-A-T, and it's nothing to do with my love for food. But EAT essentially is environments, adults, technology. As I unpack it, essentially what we're saying is that if the environment around the child improves, then the outcomes for children improve. But more or less, we work with children who are less than 6 years of age. The agency of building that environment usually rests with adults who are usually parents or their preschool teachers, and we see that when we let these adults design that environment, we feel that the overall outcomes will improve. But if you actually step back and look at who this adult is essentially a child a generation ago who's been entrenched in intergenerational poverty, chronic stress. There are people who are accessing government school system because they cannot access private school systems at this point in time. And so these are children from a generation ago whose core life skills essentially, whose executive functions haven't been developed as much as they should have been. And so essentially what you're asking this person to do is to create an environment for their child, something that they themselves haven't ever experienced. And for me, that essentially is an inflection point, because how does a florist, for example, create a rocket ship, right? It's a difficult thing to do, and that inflection point essentially takes us to really two things, which is how do you then expect adults to build this environment? And if we actually look at the problem, it can be broken down into two aspects. And assuming that parents want to build a better environment for their child, the problem can be broken down into what do the parents need to do and how do they need to do it, right? And that for us is the point of integration of technology as well as the offline component, which is essentially champions. So what we do with parents specifically is we work with these preschool teachers who are called Anganwadi workers in the context of India, loosely termed as preschool teachers. Anganwadi workers essentially, in context of Meraki, what we do is we have two programs. One is which work in sync with each other. One is the ECCE Day. So we've revived Early Childhood Care and Education Day across these two states. It happens every 14th of every month, where essentially we organize parent collectives. Each of these 47,000 schools have their parent collectives come into these schools, and essentially it's designed to initiate a discussion on parenting, on early childhood development, on concepts of child development essentially. And what we've seen that does is sort of lower the learning barrier for these families, because it's kind of difficult to sort of be in a situation where everything else is going wrong and somebody's actually coming in telling you that I'll tell you what you need to do. So that learning barrier lowers. There's a social component to learning in that entire setup. But most importantly, I feel what happens is that there is a trust that is established. From our work, I think what we've learned is it's not just the message, but the messenger. Both of them are supremely important. And then this preschool teacher essentially then is the messenger. While this component of parent collectives happens on 14th of every month, there is a complementary program called Digital Parent Margdarshak Program, which essentially creates those regular daily nudges, where what we've done is picked up contemporary science, which talks about early childhood development, packaged them into 10-minute activities that parents can do every single day with their child. And so that becomes the daily nudge that the parents need.
That's great.
So really, overall framing happens at the preschool teacher level, at the adult level, and the reminding and reinforcing happens at the tech level. And so environments are built through these adults who use technology to then remind and reinforce day to day.
Great. And how many people are in the world of your technology?
So in terms of families, we have access to around 1.3 million families who are accessed through these 47,000 preschools in 2 states in India.
That's great. So Erin, I want you to take it to the micro level. You talked earlier about the largeness of your group, how many thousands of students at a time. Can you tell us a story about impact, going down to the individual level? Because sometimes I think with technology, people think, oh, it's just going out there, who knows if there's any impact there. Can you tell us a quick story about impact, and then Richard, we will close with you before we open it up to the audience.
That sounds great. An example of impact I have is that, kind of like you said, we have a whole lot of numbers, we have a lot of data, and we ourselves wanted to know what is actually there on the ground. So we held an in-person engineering showcase where we invited schools also use our tools. So we invited any schools who wanted to come, and then we invited the students from way out in the villages who are out of school youth to come, and facilitated them, helped pay their transport to come in, and had this beautiful showcase. And the person who won the showcase, who had the best technology, was a 19-year-old who was pregnant with her 3rd child, who built a pedal-powered washing machine, which she uses to generate income. She also makes her own homemade laundry detergent, if you're interested. And she uses that to generate income for her family. So I think that is an example of, you were getting these numbers back in, and we're really hoping the skills they learn are being employed, and then you just get that little tiny peek into it. And I think that means a lot for her community also. It's not just this one person now is earning money. It's other young mothers, right? Seeing that. And women especially have stigmas in their communities when they get pregnant at a young age, which is often not their fault, as well as a lot of out-of-school youth get harassed in these communities as seen as not smart, and they have a lot of challenges. And so seeing them make technologies, use them, is, I think, empowering, not just for that individual, but the community they live in.
Great. Richard, talk a little bit about scaling. What have you learned about scaling? How do you scale something that has an online part but also an offline part, and make sure that you end up in the world of impact?
Yeah, it's always a tension, right? So we always made an intentional decision that scale is important and scale will come, but it has to come with impact, right? So I actually reject the premise that you can only scale a tech solution if you dilute its impact. I think that's a cop-out, frankly. So what we've done is we sort of built our base, spent years. I was talking to an investor yesterday who's one of the very few investors I've ever met that said, no, we understand that it might take 3 years for you to actually build the quality first. Like it's quality first. The scale will come with quality, which is the journey we've been on. In 3 or 4 years with very little scale and lots of quality, and then the next 6 years with a whole lot of scale. And so we for example, just we've just expanded to a pilot in Cambodia. Cambodia is a really different place to Australia in a lot of ways. And part of the questions there, well, what scales, what doesn't, how does it work? And so again, it turns out when you have a really high quality base in mathematics of curriculum, assessment, diagnostic, teacher training, teacher development, like these are all the core elements. We took them, we adapted a few, we did some translation work, obviously, although less than you would have thought, it turns out. And in the kind of, yes, there's a lot of setup work and preparation in that kind of scale work, but I went to Phnom Penh, I ran a weekend of training with teachers in the Teach for Cambodia network. 3 days later, they were implementing our model in their classrooms, and the 9-week pilot, 600 kids, the kids did 2 things. They made 22 weeks worth of progress in 9 weeks in a context that was wildly different to where we built it. And that speaks to the logic model behind the scale, right? But then actually my favorite part of that was a story. I asked one teacher, I said, what did you think was the impact? Like, well, how did you feel? We measure the data about student growth and mathematics, and she said 2 things, which just confused me, but are wonderful. She said, I sleep more and I yell less. And I said, no, I'm sorry, I don't understand. Like, what do you mean? She said, well, I mean, they have 60 kids in a class. And they're not, I mean, they're great kids. They behave a heck of a lot better than Australian kids in classes. But again, they're very distributed, and the amount of marking and prep and admin time she had to do beforehand, it was just insane. And we forget these are things that help scale. We took all the menial stuff away, left her to do the value, and so she could sleep. And she said, and also I used to have to yell. I had to get the kids on task. I had to convince them how important this was. She says now they just walk in and go. And so yeah, I think scale has to be designed. You can't. I mean, I know. Look, you can. The joke I've made to a few people in this conference is if I wanted to make a lot of money, I would not be in education. There's not the space. But I mean, and you can build a widget or a tool or a toy that gets to 1 million teachers in a day. Sure. And if it gets to 1 million teachers in a day and transforms the lives of those kids and teachers, well, then you're better than I am. Great. But I think you have to have designed that understanding of what does your impact mean, how do you build it, and then hold yourself to account.
That's great. So as hopefully a couple folks will think about the questions you have, my reflection from building Braven, like I said, it's a hybrid model. 80% of the content is actually online, very much so attached to what we've heard from the 3 panelists. That said, it really doesn't matter if it doesn't work. And so what I've learned over time is that we're at 7,000 students, clearly not at the thousands and thousands and on the way to millions as some of these folks, but to go slow to go fast. Because actually if you build it well and build it right, we were at 17 students at one point in time to now be at 7,000 students. And basically it was because we did figure out how to blend the offline or the technology piece or the online piece with the offline piece, which was actually the human connection, which at least in our context matters an enormous amount, because I often say in the world of getting a job here in the US, it's not just what you know or who you know, it's actually who knows you. And we've realized that you could actually go slow to go fast and then get to more and more scale over time. And we look forward to in the next 5 years or so getting to 40,000 young people, and then the next 10 years getting to 80 to 100,000 young people. So, but we'd love to hear what questions you all have from the audience perspective about how do you scale technologies in places that are hard to do that in, while also not losing the in-person human impact touch. What questions do you have? If not, we can, of course, continue our dialogue. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your stories. I think you all are so inspirational, traveled the furthest, and I feel like with all the people at the conference, you all are really helping the kids who have the least amount of access. So kudos to all of you. One question I had, AI has been a big topic of conversation in the conference, and you all talked about kind of this mix of very high-tech and low-tech solutions. And just thinking about the kids that you all are working with now who potentially are not only digital natives, but potentially AI natives, knowing how quickly this technology develops. And I was wondering how you all see that as potentially impacting your solutions and the kids that you serve.
Anyone?
Okay. Do you want to?
I mean, I can go. Most of the families that we work with actually are rural families. In India, I think two technologies are kind of universal. One is YouTube, one is WhatsApp. But the devices are not. They are sort of the lower end of the spectrum in terms of devices that they have access to. I make the point around, I think I'm cautiously optimistic about using AI. So we've developed actually chatbots on Telegram, Facebook. We've done that in 2016, 2017, shifted to a more in-person plus tech kind of a solution eventually. And the reason I think that I have for doing that are, I think at this point in time, two. One is there is a huge challenge of, in terms of equity. I think AI is, specifically aspects around generative AI, I think there is a challenge of equity. Currently, we are actually trying to develop a chatbot that uses AI to reach these families, specifically on WhatsApp, but it's extremely expensive for us as well as for the families to access, and I think that's one challenge. Secondly, I think even though this chatbot on WhatsApp is I think it connects with parents more because it sort of takes in their preferences. But I think overall, when I talk about AI in education, I feel that currently at this point, and I'm thinking that this will be solved, but there is this like pull and push happening on two ends. One is that our civil laws essentially talk about equity, equality, and all of those aspects, whereas AI talks about user preference. And I feel like that there is at this point in time, they are not on the same side. I think there is time for us to sort of solve that problem. And once we do solve that problem, I think challenges, for example, around bullying of kids that can happen through AI can be solved. But I think our laws and then user preferences has to somehow come together for us to be able to solve that. I'm optimistic. I definitely think that with the usage of AI in WhatsApp, it will be able to sort of create the kind of solutions that parents and families need. But I think there is a lot of work that's left to do for us to actually end there.
Can I just add really quickly? I think one of the things for me, my favorite AI-related phrase from the last 6 months has been, you will not be replaced by an AI, you will be replaced by a human who can use AI. And I think one of the kind of equity pieces and education pieces, and we've seen this in our own work, even in kind of adult life, and it's really relevant to kids going through the school system at this moment, is that if you have the kind of technical capability, and I don't mean from a coding sense necessarily, although that's a way it plays out, to actually make use of the models and tools that are being developed and not just be a consumer of whatever AI startups are currently producing, that's going to make a real difference to your ability to operate at a high level within the world that's coming. So I see a slightly concerning divide between, so there's a lot of folk here building really cool stuff with AI. We have the power when we can do that, right? So if you can sit and take like the stuff that sits behind the back end of OpenAI, and you can fine-tune those models, and you can use them for your own context. That's awesome. We can do anything with that, right? Except maths, but we'll get there. But if you, on the other hand, are limited to saying, well, I'm just going to use whatever companies produce for me, then you don't understand how those are produced. You don't understand their inherent biases. You don't understand. So like, my challenge is, do you know why ChatGPT-4 cannot produce a reliable link to a video? It's a really simple explanation, right? If you don't know why, though, you're not going to understand what you're getting out of the thing. And so I think for me, it's that the building this fundamental understanding in kids of what's happening around them and the why. Part of that is maths, part of that is science and understanding it. But it's really risky if we just create a generation of users of AI rather than people who have the power to actually understand it. So.
That's great.
Can I just add to this? I think essentially what you're talking about is learning to learn, like kids having the idea of how to learn. Secondly, I think one just small point is that at this point in time, there are a lot of apps that are using AI to develop stuff. I think it will really become really accessible when the devices themselves are sort of powered by AI, and everyone then will have access. And I think equity piece in that way can be solved for. But again, I think there is some time to go for that to happen.
That's great. Erin, what is your kind of wrap-up thought as you think about serving students in hard-to-reach places, but doing that in terms of impact?
So I think I think I'll touch on the AI piece as I'm wrapping up, because it can be hard at the outset to see like how, right? Like there's a huge divide already. As you said, the AI is only going to make it farther apart. And I have a friend who runs another program in Uganda, and she always says, I'm building for the future and you're building for the now, right? So giving students these foundational skills so that when these things get there, they'll be ready for them. And one of the things that we are building for, we always say, is to get Africans a seat at the table. Like you said, if they are not helping build these algorithms, then they're not going to know who you are, and they're not going to recognize you, and they're not going to be built for you. A really low-tech example is solar panels, these flat solar panels designed in European countries. That's fabulous. In Africa, parabolic solar panels are much more effective, and it took like 2 decades for that to actually click for people. And so that's what I think as far as how can AI impact these areas, and as well as when you're thinking about these numbers of students and these programs, I think it's really powerful to remember that you can get to young people right now using old technology. And once you've gotten to them, then you can start feeding them more things that will help close that digital divide, right? But you're not going to have like the trust of the communities or access to these communities if you don't first go in there, gain their trust, and use the tools that they already are using.
Thank you so much to this incredible panel that has figured out how to use technology to serve students in hard-to-reach places while also making sure there's impact, which is what I always worry about, whether it's AI or anything else. Will there be impact to that individual level? So thank you all so much for joining us. Abby, did you want to say one thing before we wrap?
Oh, well, first off, I'm Abby. Thank you all.
From
2006 New York City Corps member, Teach for America staff member, Teach for All staff member, and now a proud member of the GSV, ASU+GSV Summit team. One quick question maybe to wrap us up. I think Wednesday especially, we have all been in so many sessions, we have learned so many things, we have all these ideas that have sparked, we've met new people. I would love to hear something that you have learned this week, something that you are kind of ruminating on, that you are excited to either bring back to your teams as you think about your impact, that you're taking away and that you're excited to implement or think about.
Great. So we will do rapid fire as a little bit of the bonus, because I know the folks on the tech end need us to move on. So quick, I'll start with you, Richard. Quickly, what have you learned? What will you take back?
So one of the views of the U.S. education system from outside the U.S., I hear 2 things from back home. One is it's broken. But the other thing I was told before I got here was don't bother. It's too complicated, it's too hard, it's too messy. Right? Don't go and try and help. The last 3 days of conversations, there are 68 million kids here. And okay, some of them don't need our help. They're going to be fine. Most of them do. And so I've penciled 4 different partnerships in the last 4 days for a bunch of folk who can help kids who desperately need it here. And I cannot wait to get going.
That's great. Erin, rapid fire.
Yeah, rapid fire would be, my eyes have been sort of opened. We've always straddled this line of like, front facing is low tech, that's what the students see. And then in the back end, there's a lot of software development that goes into pulling this program together. And I had never thought that ChatGPT would have any place in that, and had a really great conversation with the founder of Learning Equality, actually, Jamie, who's here, that you could actually use ChatGPT to lessen the pressure on our helplines. So we have a whole core of teachers receiving all these calls for help, and they, with 30,000 kids, they are exhausted. And so if you could, we use SMS, right? If you could have ChatGPT programmed and could go through SMSs, again, program it on our end, all the heavy stuff is on our end, and from the student's end, they just send an SMS asking for help, and they get this really personalized interaction back and forth, and all of a sudden, you've kept the pieces that you need to reach those 100 million students, but then all of a sudden you're leveraging these really cool new tools, and yeah, I think it's really exciting. That's one thing I've taken away.
Seemant.
For me, a couple of things I think got reinforced. One is, this is probably the first conference I've seen where there's so much conversation about parents and families. That was amazing, to be honest. This is generally never happens. I think a couple of interesting models around funding families and sort of creating school choice. I think in the preschool system, the governments in India or the state governments in India still are looking at very like siloed version where they only think about government preschools. I think there needs to be a more sectoral view, and I think that's something that came out from a lot of conversation that I was part of. Secondly, I think in terms of just generative AI, one of my beliefs essentially is that content is kind of sorted for. I think content generation and cataloging has been solved by ChatGPT, and I think it'll continue to get better. But again, something that I think needs more work is how do you create access of that content? What is the, for example, what is the pedagogical aspect of delivering that content? And I think that bit at this point in time is not really solved for. I do think that it will be solved for by using AI, but there are certain human aspects that I think still need to be persisted with, even though they might be inefficient, but they essentially are the ones that make you human. Aspects like responsiveness, care in conversations, being persistent with families or children that you're working with, I think are still components that might be difficult to decode in terms of AI, but these kinds of ideas I think got reinforced for me. Thank you.
Yeah, what I will wrap with is, just given we're on a panel of Teach for All, Wendy has exited the room, but will get a Lifetime Achievement Award tonight. I think people underestimate the power of actually getting in front of students every day for at least a couple years, and what you'll learn not only about yourself, but also what you'll learn about them and the ability to actually create things that make sense and lead to impact for real. And I feel like just being in this room and other rooms, like ultimately, hopefully all the technology that will be developed, whether it's AI, ChatGPT, whatever, will actually lead to impact in terms of shrinking inequality here in the US and across the globe. Thank you so much.